Welcome back to Close Up. The debate over a pair of voting bills at the State House has two sharply divided sides. College students who feel their right to vote is under siege, and Republicans who contend that those students from out of state should be voting in the states they come from. Here to discuss this morning are University of New Hampshire students Abigail Colby and Ben Kramer. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Representative David Bates, a Republican from Windham. We appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Let's start with you, Representative Bates. You were the author of the original piece of legislation that got all this started, HB 372. Explain the intent of your bill.
The intent, quite simply, is to make our current definition of the word resident constitutional, because back in 1974 there was a federal court case that ruled that the portion of the statute that says a person must have an intent to remain for the indefinite future, the court found that to be a violation of the Constitution. They specifically said that it offends the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So as long as our definition has a requirement to remain, to have an intention to remain for the indefinite future, that is unconstitutional. So the bill does nothing more than to strike that phrase so that our definition of resident would be acceptable with application to voting laws.
And so the consequences would be someone who is voting would need to show that intent through registering a car, getting a driver's license, something like that?
Not exactly, okay? I had a number of bills that would have worked in concert that would have essentially reverted back to what we had decades ago, which is that a person had to be a resident of the state in order to vote here. And back in that 70s era, the Constitution was changed, statutes were changed, and we've morphed into this situation now where a person merely needs to claim domicile. And so we have a current situation where non-residents are allowed to vote here just by claiming domicile. And I think that that's a rather absurd proposition. We should go back to our former policy, our former laws, which stated you had to be a resident of the state in order to vote here.
All right, Abigail and Ben, you're on the other side of this, starting with you. Abigail, you've grown up in Durham, so this doesn't necessarily apply to you, but this is something of great concern to students right now. Explain why.
Absolutely, yeah. This is a concern to students because we come from far and wide. I come from Durham, so not so far, but Ben comes from Connecticut, and we have students nationwide who have chosen to come to New Hampshire to do their 4 years, which is a great thing. And New Hampshire's an exciting state. We have the primary, you know, we're first in the nation, and students want to vote, and they're here, and they deserve to vote. And so we really think this is a pressing matter because you deserve to vote where you live, and right now students live here during their 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And some would contend that this bill does require some sort of, intent. So you register your car, you pay for a driver's license. What's wrong with that, Ben? Why do you think that, as someone coming from Connecticut, that you shouldn't have to do that?
Yeah, so I think the intent of this bill, whatever it may be, I'm sure it's all well and good. The fact of the matter is that this bill puts in place a whole process that's triggered by the act of voting that is expensive, it's logistically challenging, it takes a lot of time, and registering your car and getting a driver's license can cost upwards of $150, which for a college student like myself, as someone who is directly affected by this bill, I would have to do all of that. That's $150 is more than a month's worth of food for me. My budget for food is less than that. It's a good chunk of my rent, and we're here to say that regardless of the intentions of this bill, the effect and the fact of the matter is that this will dissuade people from voting. And young people, especially in this state, are a critical voting bloc. And if we want to retain young people and have a prosperous state for the future with our aging demographics, we need to be doing things to retain young people and to make them feel encouraged to stay here and be involved here. And this bill simply doesn't do that, in addition to just flying in the face of the notion of an accessible democratic process.
Representative Bates, there does seem to be a bit of a gray area here. If Ben's been here for 3 years in New Hampshire for most of the year, when should he start thinking of himself as someone who should be participating in the public process?
Well, first of all, I disagree with Ben and his belief about what the effect of this bill will be. This does not change the voting requirements. The requirements or your eligibility to vote are in RSA 654(7), and those requirements are not changed by this bill. This is the definition of the word resident, which actually isn't even used in the voting statute. So this has no direct bearing upon your eligibility to vote. Having said that, though, I'm not sure I understand why Ben or others feel that they're entitled to be treated differently from everyone else in the state. You know, we all pay the same amount of money for food, depending on how much you eat, of course. But everyone else who is a resident of this state, excuse me, accepts the responsibility of residency, and that involves, you know, paying your taxes and registering your automobile, having a driver's license. Those are motor vehicle laws, the ones that you're particularly concerned about. There's no connection to the voting laws. And the state statute here in New Hampshire and most other states requires a person who is driving in the state to have that state's driver's license. And so really what it comes down to is the person's intent. I have no problem with students voting. Certainly, Abigail, you know, there's no question about you're a resident of this state. The question comes when somebody has come here from somewhere else. Really, where is their home? And if they love New Hampshire as much as you do, if you want to make New Hampshire your home, you've come to school here from some other state, you can become a resident and have the same privileges and responsibilities as everyone else. But those who claim that the requirement to register your car or to have a driver's license is a de facto after-the-fact poll tax, which is an oxymoron to begin with, is really kind of a silly objection to, you know, this legislation, because if that were true, then the 1 million registered voters in the state would all be paying a poll tax because we have driver's licenses. But that's not the case, okay? It's not reasonable or legitimate to call this an after-the-fact poll tax. And in fact, the legislation we're talking about doesn't even directly require it anyway. As I said, other legislation would have to be filed and passed in order to do those kind of things that they're talking about.
One of the arguments Republicans make is, why not just get an absentee ballot and vote in Connecticut? How do you respond to that?
I'd love to respond to that question. I could do that, and I think that would be, for me at least, I would consider that to be largely a waste of my vote, because this is my community, this is where I live. I've lived here for 3 going on 4 years. I have spent minimal time in Connecticut in those past couple years, and this is my community, and if I were to vote in Connecticut, I really would never see the effect of that vote playing out in my everyday life on me in New Hampshire. This is my community, and I really want to be able to affect it with my vote because it's where I live.
And if that's the case, my question to you would be, then why are you object to being considered a resident of the state? If this is your home, why don't you want to be a resident?
I don't object to being called a resident of the state, but I think it's important to remember that this is a conversation about voting and not about residency. We're saying that we have seen in our experience and in my personal life and in our work on the ground interacting with thousands of students since December on this issue is that putting this language and tying this to voting will most certainly dissuade students from voting, which is wrong and not what we need in this state. So this is a conversation about voting and not residency, and we're saying that by incurring this kind of language and making people think that no matter what the actual intentions or the actual processes that are written in this law are, in fact, that if you make people think that by voting they're going to have to go to the DMV and get a driver's license and register their car there and wait in line and fill out forms, is going to dissuade people from voting. And we've seen that on the ground, and we think that that is most certainly true. And I think the governor agrees with us that this would in fact result in a suppression of the student vote.
And I think that, Abigail, you've also made the point, these are legal terms, so it's not just the student vote here. You've also raised concerns about military families.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm not incredibly versed on the legal logistics of domicile versus citizen versus resident, you know, but the fact of the matter is that New Hampshire does have an incredible number of transient people who come into the state for a certain amount of time. We don't know how long that's going to be. It could be 4 years for a student, it could be 4 years for military, and they deserve to vote where they're impacted, and that's currently where they're living. So I think that this bill affects students. This bill affects many people. It's not. It's about who has the right to vote, and I think that's anyone who's currently living in New Hampshire. All
right. Well, we certainly could talk about this a lot longer, but we're out of time, unfortunately. But Abigail, Ben, and Representative Bates, we thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Yeah. When we come back, there's more to unpack from this debate. Our senior political reporter John DeStaso will join us to sort out what could happen to HB 1264 and HB 372.